But now, we are looking forward to the lecture of our first speaker, Andreas Malm, whom I probably don't need to introduce to many in this room. Andreas is one of the most important intellectual voices on the climate crisis, not only in academia, but also politically in the climate movement. As Associate Professor of Human Ecology at Lund University in Sweden, he has attracted worldwide attention with his books on the connection between the climate crisis and capitalism. I only mention here Fossil Capital, the Rise of Steam Power and the Roots of Global Warming from 2016, The Progress of the Storm, Nature and Society in a Warming World from 2018, his Corona book that was published in German in 2020 under the title Climax, and in the same year his most publicly known and I think also most controversial book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, that actually made it into an US-American action thriller movie with the same title last year, relying on basic ideas in Andreas' bestseller. His latest books are so far White Skin, Black Fuel from 2021, and from February this year, Fighting in a World on Fire, The Next Generation's Guide to Protecting the Climate and Saving Our Future. With his works and writings, Andreas Malm has gained great influence, I think, in two ways. On the one hand, he plays a leading role in developing a critical theory of the ecological crisis and something like a modern ecological Marxism. His studies come down to the question how we can free ourselves from fossil capitalism, taking a very insightful stand on many controversial topics in social theory today. On the other hand, he is an activist intellectual who, in close contact with the climate movement, has set up important keywords that worked as political interventions in the struggle for the future of this planet, like the danger of fossil fascism, the idea to overcome the ecological crisis by a kind of war communism, or the strategy of sabotage in the struggle against fossil capital. For all these reasons, we very much welcome Andreas to our conference today, and we look forward to his lecture entitled Overshoot: Climate Politics When It's Too Late.
Right, thank you for that extremely generous introduction, Sighard, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for showing up at this pretty ungodly hour, in my view at least. I tend to schedule my lectures never earlier than 1 o'clock, so let's see if my brain is alert enough for doing this. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present work in progress based on a book I'm writing together with my colleague Wim Carton with this working title. These reflections will be provisional. They are dealing with things that are happening virtually as we speak. They are an attempt to sort of write a history of the present, to catch history as it flies, which is an inherently impossible project. It's not like when you write about, let's say, deforestation in the Carolingian period, and you look at that history, it's, you know, many centuries away, and it's a closed chapter. There are no closed chapters here. Everything is happening and being renewed and taking new turns and spiraling on for every day, which makes this book project almost hopeless. On the other hand, I have a little bit of a worry that what I'm going to say here is all old fare for you, that there's nothing new here. We'll see. So, like I said, everything is really happening on a daily basis, and I think that if there's any shared humanity left in us, if we consider the lives of others far away from us of the same value as our own, or even just nearly the same, we should all really be reeling from the shock of what has just happened in Libya. The disaster there is of an unprecedented scale, I think, when it comes to the intensity and the mass casualty toll from a climate disaster. The figures now are that up to 100,000 people might have lost their lives. That's about the total of the number of people that are missing in Derna and other parts of eastern Libya. A worry we have to have here is that we're getting used to these kind of disasters. They don't really make a major splash in the sense that, oh, it's just another mega disaster. And it tends to happen among people who are brown or black, Libyans, Egyptians, Palestinians in this area, who get washed out into the sea. And the sea, of course, already being a graveyard for exactly these people, thanks to how the EU is dealing with this sea. I think that the reactions would have been a little bit different had those 10 to 100,000 people instead died in Greece. That didn't happen. Instead, the casualty toll from Storm Daniel in Greece stayed at, I think, around a dozen or something like that. However, we saw just before the Storm Daniel hit Libya, Greece being in an extremely precarious situation with having, on the one hand, the largest wildfire in the history of Europe, and on the other, these absolutely unprecedented torrential rains in the center of the country. Before that, just before that, Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil was hit by its worst ever natural disaster when a cyclone killed dozens of people. Just before that, we had the deadliest wildfires in the US in at least a century, with the fires in Hawaii killing about 200 people. Just before that, we had an extreme winter heat wave in the Andes. Just before that, we had the heaviest rains ever recorded in Japan, with floods and landslides. And you recognize the pattern because it's become part of the background noise to how we live, even if we don't personally are affected by it. We hear about it all the time, and it's a wave that keeps surging, and no one really knows what to do about it. And these are, of course, just some of the events of the last few weeks. And the danger, I think, here is that there's a process of normalization where we get accustomed to this as just being a facet of contemporary life, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And there's no link whatsoever between this growing climate suffering on the one hand and the trends in actually existing capitalism on the other, because what's happening there is that we are having a fossil fuel frenzy at this moment. Last year, the oil and gas companies, all the big ones, made the largest profits in their entire histories. BP, Total, Shell, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Saudi Aramco, all posted the largest profits in their entire histories as corporate entities. And in the case of Saudi Aramco, these profits might well have been the largest profits ever recorded by any private company in the entire history of the capitalist mode of production. And the result of this is, of course, because capital always seeks the highest profits, is that more capital is being reallocated into investment in fossil fuels. And you've seen this with the recent announcement from BP and Shell saying that no, we're actually not going to expand our renewables portfolio as we promised. This was most, of course, promised with the most fanfare by BP in 2020. BP has twice, at least, in its recent history, tried to rebrand itself as a company very much devoted to solar and wind and other renewables. But twice they have also reneged from this promise and said, no, actually we're not going to do it because it doesn't give us any profits. or it doesn't give us sufficient profits. So BP has now sort of scrapped its plans to expand in solar and wind for the second time, just as they did a little less than 20 years ago. And Shell has done the same thing. ExxonMobil never cared about saying that we're going to produce solar and wind, although they love to use solar power to power their own oil fields because it's the cheapest form of electricity. So they recently, outwards they say, it's impossible for the world economy to rely on renewable sources because they are so intermittent and whatnot. But recently, ExxonMobil signed contracts for supplying 70% of the electricity to their oil fields in Texas from solar and wind because it's the cheapest source of electricity. So you reduce operational costs and then increase the profit margins on your oil and gas. But ExxonMobil has never bothered, nor Chevron, with any kind of, promises to sell solar and wind, which they also claim is one reason that they've been the most profitable of all these companies. Now, this is not just a quirk among executives in the big oil and gas companies. These choices are made under shareholder pressure, and it's exactly the same choices that banks and the big asset managers are making as well. Profit rates from the production and sale of fossil fuels are so many times higher than the ditto for renewable energy that it's absolutely irresistible for capital to flow in the direction of fossil fuels. So with the windfall profits, the profit bonanza that we've seen in the past years, since the end of the pandemic essentially, these trends are reinforced. And we see asset managers like BlackRock also completely abandoning their previous talk about becoming climate friendly and things like that. And banking on fossil fuels again. Just at the very moment when we are seeing this daily exacerbation of climate disasters and we're edging very close to a new average of 1.5 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. I think 7 words from Theodor Adorno sum up the situation here. Society is not in control of itself. Things are out of control. Things are completely, infernally, demoniacally out of control. The classes ruling this planet seem bent on burning as much of it as fast as physically possible, and nothing has yet reined them in to even the most minimal degree. Capitalist society is here enacting a dissociation between the reality of climate breakdown and the interior drives of accumulation. And in the physiology of this highly, highly peculiar type of society, there are no synapses connecting the information and experience of the catastrophe unfolding with the centers of decision making, above all concerning what energy sources to use. And one way of measuring this sort of disconnect is to have a look at this graph, which charts the historical path of CO2 emissions since 2000 and the reductions needed to stay within the carbon budget for the Paris goals. These being totally mainstream estimations of where exactly these carbon budgets lie, and recent revisions of climate sensitivity and emissions already made would probably reduce the budget even further. But as you can see, if we're going to have a reasonable chance of staying at 1.5 degrees, emissions trajectories need to completely break with what we're actually seeing happening in the capitalist society we live in. And likewise for 1.7, and actually likewise for 2 as well. If trends continue anywhere like they've done in recent years, we're going to shoot past all of these targets. And this is the source of the notion of overshoot. And the idea of overshoot comes in a few different forms. First, it was developed in integrated assessment models, or IAMs, one of those enormously beautiful acronyms that litter climate discourse. These models where you have the climate system coupled to a system of the economy, and the modelers can come up with scenarios and model the consequences of various choices. And early in this century, starting around, it really took off around 2010 and the years after. Some of these teams doing this kind of IAM modeling came up with the idea that rather than going for extremely rapid and supposedly costly emissions reductions now in the short term, it would be more cost efficient to let temperatures temporarily go above 2 degrees and then 1.5 degrees, which came later into the models, and overshoot these targets and then claw the temperature rise back down by some technology that would materialize in the latter part of this century and supposedly be cheaper or offer a cheaper way of taking away the CO2 from the atmosphere than actually preventing the emissions from happening in the first place. Because this would, and this is the core of the matter, inflict serious losses on fixed capital, on the big investments in oil and gas and coal infrastructure. And the technology in question here had another beautiful acronym that you might have heard of, namely BECS, Bioenergy Carbon Capture and Storage. So the idea in these models was that we can overshoot 1.5 and 2 degrees, and then we're going to roll out this technology that doesn't exist anywhere on Earth yet, but that we have modeled in our scenarios. So it's completely speculative technology called BECS. And BECS is then that you plant large fields with some fast-growing trees, such as eucalyptus, and then you harvest these trees, and you drive them, you get them into a power plant, you set them on fire, so you get electricity in the process, it's a biofuel. And in this plant you also have a kind of filter on the chimney. I'm simplifying a little bit, and this filter captures the CO2, and you purify the CO2 in a pure stream, and you inject it into the ground. And if you keep repeating this process, you have a kind of pump for extracting CO2 from the atmosphere by means of photosynthesis, as plants naturally do. And since these are fast-growing plants, they have this process on steroids. And you take the CO2 away, you put it under the ground. This technology, like I said, was, when it started entering this model, a non-existing technology. There was one pilot plant in Iowa, but essentially a completely speculative technology. That, however, became a kind of silver bullet or magic presence in these models for showing how you can keep below the limit of first 2 and then 1.5 degrees, with the special report of the IPCC in 2018, and after COP21 in Paris, 1.5 became the target mostly in focus, but this is applicable to 2 as well. So the idea being that, okay, we're going to let temperatures rise above 1.5, but then towards the end of the century, we're going to go back down by rolling down this technology for carbon dioxide removal, also referred to as negative emissions technologies. This is what we refer to as programmatic overshoot. So the idea that we should do this, we can do this, it's the most cost-efficient thing to do. And pretty remarkably, virtually all the models that the IPCC has used in its recent reports for showing how we're going to respect the 1.5 limit over the course of this century contains either a limited or a massive component of BECS, of this kind of overshoot and then return to 1.5. So it's become pervasive in official climate science and policy, this idea of overshoot and then going back. And it's an incredibly problematic idea for a lot of reasons. And I'll touch upon some. But we are sort of extending the term of overshoot a little bit, because we think that what we're seeing is more than just this narrow programmatic notion of overshoot as presented in the IAMs. We are seeing the development of something that we call an overshoot ideology, whose core doctrine, I would say, is emissions are out of control, and we have no project for bringing them under control, and so we must try different ventures than classical mitigation. Mitigation being defined as shutting down the sources of CO2 emissions. And I'll give you a few examples of what this ideology can look like. But we also believe that we are entering into something we might call the overshoot conjuncture, as a particular moment in human history, climate history and climate politics, namely the period when officially declared limits to global warming are exceeded or are in the process of being exceeded, and the dominant classes responsible for the excess have to come up with some secondary backup measures for managing the fallout, the consequence. And the three prongs of managing overshoot are pretty evident. There's not much doubt about the nature of the three prongs for doing this, and they appear in programmatic overshoot, so in the modeling, they appear in overshoot ideology, and they also are starting to appear as more or less real, actual practices. The three are adaptation, carbon dioxide removal, and solar geoengineering. And one way of illustrating this graphically, that it has become a little bit popular, at least in circulation, is to do it this way, sometimes referred to as the napkin diagram. So here's business as usual, no emissions policies, and the idea is, okay, this is going to take us into utter disaster, but if we combine these three other methods, then we can probably live with it. So there's going to be a component of emissions abatement, or what we call mitigation. This is assumed, but it's the one big question that we're going to return to. Then the idea is, okay, you have quite a big chunk of carbon dioxide removal. So you take CO2 back down, put it down under the earth. And then you have solar geoengineering, which according to this graph is mobilized and deployed at a certain level, and it's referred to as shaving off the peak of warming. And then, this is very much an idealization, something we'll return to as well, then it's phased out. And then at the sort of bottom of this pyramid you have adaptation. And if you do all these three things, carbon dioxide removal, solar geoengineering, adaptation successfully, you can limit the environmental and human impacts, even though you're departing from a trajectory of very high and continuous emissions. Can you follow this so far? Yeah. So this book that we're writing sort of begins by setting the stage of this whole programmatic overshoot ideology, the overshoot conjuncture, and then digs deep down into the drivers of these processes with a focus on the fossil fuel profits and the assets that are called into question through the still very hypothetical phenomenon of asset stranding. And then we'll look at adaptation and removal and geoengineering in turn. This, by the way, it's the same framework. I don't know if you saw the news yesterday that a group calling themselves the Overshoot Management Commission based in Paris released a report yesterday that is based precisely on these three categories as well. Thankfully, that report wasn't as evil as I had expected, but it's definitely problematic. Anyway, adaptation. So the idea of adaptation has come naturally, in a sense, from the very start to people who think that mitigation is a far too radical idea. The idea that, okay, we can't stop global warming. Fossil fuels are just too essential. We can't rid ourselves of them. So the alternative is to try to live with it. And in one of the earliest high-profile articles on overshoot in the peer-reviewed literature, this was published in Nature in 2009 by one of the lead authors was a co-chair of the fourth IPCC assessment report. The schema and the headline was Overshoot, Adapt, and Recover. So what they argued in this piece was that, okay, we're going to miss those targets, and because we're going to miss them, we have to learn to live with them instead and invest in adaptation. So they even wrote, we should be planning to adapt to at least 4 degrees of warming. This is a very long-standing argument in bourgeois climate economics and elsewhere. But the moment we're finding ourselves in right now is one where this is beginning to be said and practiced to a degree on the ground. Just one example, on the 17th of July, The Guardian reported from the extreme flooding that was happening in South Korea. And I'm just going to read briefly from this report. Rescuers in South Korea have recovered a total of 13 bodies from a flooded road tunnel in a central city, as the death toll from flash floods and landslides triggered by days of heavy rain rose to at least 40 on Monday. Typical piece of news, summer of 2023, nothing extraordinary about it. The devastation prompted the country's president, Yoon Suk-yeol, to warn that the climate crisis had made extreme weather a fact of life. Quote, this kind of extreme weather event will become commonplace. We must accept climate change is happening and deal with it, end quote. Yoon said as he prepared to visit flood-hit North Gyeongsang province. Apologies for the pronunciation. Yoon called for extraordinary determination to improve the country's preparedness and response measures. So what he said here is that, okay, this is a fact of life. We now have climate change. There's nothing to do about it. So we have to adapt, and we have to have better systems in place for evacuating people, warning them, not building in the wrong places, and so on and so forth. And this ideology, we call it muscular adaptationism, as a kind of a subset of Overshoot ideology, is now starting to circulate more and more. Wall Street Journal ran a piece the other day following in the wake of the devastating fires in Hawaii with the headline, How Better Tech Could Save Lives in a World of Bigger, Faster, More Devastating Fires. I'm going to read briefly again. A wide array of new technologies are being tested and deployed that can alert authorities minutes after a fire starts. These include tower-mounted cameras that use artificial intelligence to identify smoke, and sensors that are installed just above the forest floor, sniffing out fires using a kind of electronic noise. Collectively, these fire prevention and fire detection systems have the potential to be stitched into comprehensive fire intelligence networks. Already, early versions of these networks are rapidly informing the actions of firefighters. In the future, they might generate alerts that help us all cope with wildfires. Fires are bigger, hotter, and more devastating, and the number of megafires that scorch more than 100,000 acres has increased sharply in the past decade. There is evidence that early detection of fires is one of the most cost-effective ways to tackle the problem of dangerous wildfires. Yeah, and we've seen this in closer to home as well here. Last year, after the extreme wildfires in France, Emmanuel Macron went out and said, in a lull in the firefighting, I quote, "We beat the beast that is these wildfires, and now we're going to have a major national project of reconstruction. We're going to stabilize the fire, go after the victory, and rebuild. We will have to adapt our concepts of civil security with more protective rules, a long-term prevention plan." And then Macron called for a larger fleet of firefighters. And I don't know if you remember, but 2 years ago when you had the very bad flooding here in Germany, Angela Merkel gave a speech on the site where she said, "Germany is a strong country. We will stand up to this force of nature in the short term, but also in the medium and long term." And then she called for various measures for adapting better to these kind of floods, with, of course, the preface, "Germany is a strong country." And you see this kind of rhetoric returning in many places, that we can defeat this nature that is coming at us if we mobilize our technologies, and it's often merged with some kind of vaguely patriotic, nationalistic, quasi-militaristic idea that if we only get our act together and beef up enough force and muscle, we're going to be able to weather this situation. And of course, the general picture that you get here is that capitalist societies can envision combating the symptoms while allowing the drivers of global heating to speed uncontrollably ahead. And in none of these moments that I've just referred to have the immediate disasters prompted any kind of initiatives for radicalized mitigation. Instead, the reflexive reaction to these disasters is, "Ow, shit, this is happening, we're going to have to adapt." And the problem here, of course, is that, okay, when the real incentives to mitigation start showing up, they're not interpreted as such, but interpreted as incentives to adaptation. So if people are not sort of realizing that we have to get rid of fossil fuels in the moment of disaster, when are they ever going to realize it? You see what I mean? Yeah. And instead the talk becomes focused on adaptation, which of course is needed, but there's a massive illusion at work here. The illusion that, okay, if we only get these intelligent firefighting networks in place, we can cope with constantly rising temperatures, or if we only get more firefighters to bomb the conflagrations in southern France, we can live with it. But of course, there's no, I mean, in this arms race between human technology and unmitigated global warming, humans are destined to be defeated, because I can't see anywhere how you can continuously build up greater technological force to keep the constantly growing disasters in check. And then the third problem with this is the problem that a lot of this will probably be maladaptation. And I'm going to focus just here for a little bit on the example of France. How long am I going to, when am I 45 minutes out? Okay, yeah. So, in France, we've had a very politically interesting situation over the past half year, where I think we've seen the first major social struggle around an adaptation project. And I'm thinking of Le Soulèvement de la Terre and its campaign against the mega basin. And the mega basin, the mega reservoirs, are a very strange phenomenon that I don't know of from anywhere else than in France. And what they do is that it's large agro-business companies who build giant tanks or water reservoirs into which they pump groundwater and keep it for irrigating their very large fields. And this is designed and advertised as a measure of adaptation to growing scarcity of water in the French countryside. So this is large agribusiness adapting to the difficulty of finding enough water to irrigate their fields by extracting groundwater and concentrating it, centralizing it in these giant they And this has, unsurprisingly, provoked a lot of anger on the French countryside, because what they mean is that small farmers are deprived of runoff and groundwater, which is instead then centralized in reservoirs, where, of course, due to the increasing temperatures, this water tends to evaporate very fast. So it's a very suboptimal way of dealing with increasingly scarce water, to put it in large reservoirs where it evaporates in the heat. And we've had a movement, Le Soulèvement de la Terre, which has fought consistently with allies in the peasant movement and elsewhere in the social movement landscape in France against these megabasins. And this movement is very interesting for many reasons. One is that I think now it actually outshines Ende Gelände. I mean, for a long time I've always seen Germany as the home of the most inspiring climate movement in Europe, and I've always considered this a paradox, because Germany, like Sweden, is generally not a place where a lot of social struggle happens, whereas France is the one country in Europe that has a living tradition of social discontent on the streets. So I've always considered this a paradox, because the climate movement has generally been stronger in Germany than in France. Now I would say that France has actually caught up and left Germany behind, because Le Soulèvement de la Terre is far eclipsing Ende Gelände in terms of how many people they get into their actions and the level of mass militancy that that movement has demonstrated. Another very interesting difference is that while Ende Gelände has focused on the lignite mine, so mitigation essentially, some of the central struggles waged by Les Soulèvements de la Terre haven't been about mitigation but about adaptation, which marks the arrival of a new front in climate politics in Europe. And this is from the most famous action that Les Soulèvements de la Terre has undertaken, namely the one against the mega basin in Sainte-Soline on the 25th of March this year, when about 30,000 people, which is, I think, more than 3 times as many as in the largest Ende Gelände camp, something like 30,000 people marched against the mega basin under construction and were met with the most extreme imaginable police brutality that you can think of in Western Europe, at least. I mean, you can go to other countries in other parts of the world and you wouldn't be surprised, but even in France, which is not a foreigner or a stranger to riots and police brutality, people were absolutely shocked by the ferocity of the militarized response, with something like 5,500 grenades of various kinds fired by the police against the demonstrators in something like an hour and a half. And this then was followed by attempts by the Interior Ministry in France to ban and dissolve the Soulèvements de la Terre, which is now upheld in court. And it really brought the struggle around the mega basin to the forefront of the French political agenda. Now, I would think that this is the first, but not the last, struggle around adaptation projects in Europe and elsewhere. I think that when you see attempts to deal with the scarcity of resources, perhaps water in particular, you will see these kind of maladaptive projects where large businesses, more or less in conjunction with a militarized state, deal with approaching scarcity by trying to appropriate and control the resources in question, and thereby exclude others from them, and that this leads to indignation and protest from people who are excluded from these resources. I think that in Europe, it's not coincidental that we see these struggles first in what is essentially part of Southern Europe, because nowadays, in the summers, the north-south axis is pretty extremely pronounced, and Southern Europe is in a far worse state than Northern Europe. This can, of course, change, but in my country, Sweden, for instance, we haven't had a really bad summer since 2018, while the summers in Italy and France and Greece tend to get worse and worse, not to mention Spain and Portugal. Water, of course, is a key resource here, and the total failure to do anything about global warming means that we'll have more problems of water scarcity in areas such as Southern Europe, and we are likely to see more contention around projects to safeguard water resources for big companies such as the large agro-industrial companies that are dominating in the French countryside. Okay, so one provisional hypothesis here is that in the overshoot conjuncture, the fronts for climate politics multiply. So we are forced to wage struggles other than those that concern mitigation. Unfortunately, and this is sort of the tragedy of the overshoot conjuncture, that it imposes on us a situation where we have to deal with other shit as well. So not only the coal mines in Germany, but also these water reservoirs in France, and who knows what the future will hold in this respect. Okay, the second, I think I'm going to have to be a little quick towards the end here, but the second major prong of the overshoot idea, of course, is carbon dioxide removal, which is at the core of it, as it's in its original iteration as a modeling outcome. And BECCS was the initial technology that was touted as the solution to the overshoot predicament. And this is how we're going to return to 1.5. We'll remove the CO2 that's emitted by establishing these BECCS plantations. Now, it became clear quite early on. Oh, I need my bag. Yeah, it became clear quite early on from critique made by some open-eyed researchers that BECCS as a large-scale solution presupposed absolutely mind-boggling amounts of land to take the CO2 down. So the question is, okay, where are we going to have all of these tree plantations for sucking the CO2 out of the air? And you know, some of the estimates are like, oh, it's going to require land the equivalent of India, or land the equivalent of all the land that is currently devoted to agriculture. I mean, it's somewhere on this size that the modeling presupposed land availability for BECCS. And this has sort of tarnished the reputation and slowed down the career of BECCS, because it runs up against a very obvious limit, which is the availability to land. I mean, you can just imagine the amount of land grabbing and accumulation by dispossession that would have to happen if BECCS were to take on real physical existence, unlike being a technology just sitting in the computer models. There would be really a new front line of climate politics if you have whatever companies are going to do this coming into, I don't know, Brazil or sub-Saharan Africa or India and finding this land for building these BECCS plantations. And this politics of land comes into play for every negative emissions technology that is based on photosynthesis in one way or another. So every kind of so-called natural solution, or every kind of negative emissions technology that is based on trees or on what grows on the land potentially runs into conflict with how other people are already using the land or want to use it, or for that matter, other species, which again then opens up a new front of climate politics where we might have to deal with the onslaught of technologies whose supposed function would be to clean up the mess that we couldn't stop happening in the first place. I'm just going to give another example because I find it a little bit remarkable from the journal Earth System Dynamics that last year published an article with the headline, "Exploration of a Novel Geoengineering Solution, Lighting Up Tropical Forests at Night." So here there's a conceptual mix between geoengineering and carbon dioxide removal. The technology here is actually one for removal, but they call it geoengineering. And the idea is, well, as in every article of this kind almost, it begins with, okay, so we're seeing emissions are just continuing to rise and seemingly they are unstoppable and we can't do anything about it. But here we have another good solution. Photosynthesis in rainforests only works in daytime. But if we can put light bulbs on top of the canopy, we can keep the photosynthesis active during nighttime as well. So therefore, much more CO2 will be sequestered. And this can serve as a vacuum pump that sucks CO2 out of the air and sequesters it under the ground. And then towards the end of the article, as a kind of an afterthought, they notice that, oh yeah, well, the actual organisms that live in the rainforest are probably used and adapted to nighttime. They have a diurnal cycle, so we don't know what's going to happen with this ecosystem when we artificially light it up all the time. This is overshoot ideology and the absurdity of it, that, okay, we find it completely impossible to establish control over fossil fuel emissions. So therefore we have to come up with something else. And why hasn't anyone thought of lighting up the rainforests all the time? This is the logic of it. And you can just try to imagine the political struggles that would break out. I mean, imagine someone parachuting into the Yanomami reservoir in Brazil and putting light bulbs on the rainforest canopy, what would the people there say? I don't think this particular technology is actually going to be implemented, but this is happening in a lot of climate science right now. This overshoot mindset that, okay, we can do it. There's no way that we can put our society under control, so therefore we're going to have to come up with these other technological solutions. The emissions technology that is now mostly that has the highest shares right now, that is attracting most of the attention, is direct air capture, which is a technology that is proven at a minimal scale, but it's at least better demonstrated than BECCS, because there are actual DAC facilities around the world. Direct air capture, another abbreviation, DAC. So you capture CO2 out of air, any ambient air, by sucking it into a machine where it's separated from other molecules in the air, and you get a pure CO2 stream, which you can do something with. And the idea here is that if you shoot it down into the ground and you mineralize it, so you turn it into stone, you can actually start reversing global warming by putting the CO2 back from where it belongs in the subterranean rocks. There are a lot of problems with this too. One major problem right now is that the entities that are perhaps most excited about carbon dioxide removal are the big oil and gas companies for various reasons. One is that they can use this purified CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And most of the DAC capacity around the world today is for this purpose. So when you have almost depleted an oil field, there is oil still left, but it's difficult to get up because you need pressure under the oil for it to reach the surface. And if you have this stream of pure CO2, you can inject it, and it serves precisely that function of providing pressure. So you have enhanced oil recovery. That means you can recover more oil out of any given reservoir of oil than you could without it. So most of this CO2 that is captured from the air by this technology is today used to bring more oil to the surface. Occidental Petroleum is a company that is going very deeply into this field. It's also the company of the big oil and gas companies that has the most aggressive plans for expanding oil in relation to the 1.5 and 2 degrees target. So their expansion projects go the furthest away from anything that is compatible with these targets. Now, the Biden administration just poured a lot of money into Oxy's DAC hub, or project for expanding DAC. So the Democratic administration in the US is actively supporting this. Another rationale in the background, and a very visionary one, is for the oil and gas companies to turn their waste product into an input. So Saudi Aramco, for instance, likes to champion the idea of a circular carbon economy. So we'll put all of this CO2 out in the atmosphere, and by means of DAC, we can draw it down and use it as an input. All sorts of technical possibilities are here being suggested. So you know that the carbon molecule, if you have it, you can, by various kinds of chemical processes, extend it and transform it, refine it into almost anything. This is, of course, something that the German chemical industry specialized in about a century ago. And with this CO2 that you have captured, you can produce synthetic fuels, you can produce sneakers, you can produce beds, you can produce almost anything. It's extremely expensive because from an energetic viewpoint, and this is a core problem of DAC, what you have is a situation where you have CO2 molecules spread out very thinly in ambient air. So it's you can think of it as scattered invisible soot. And the challenge for DAC then is to take hold of these fragments that are flying around invisibly and concentrate them. And to do that, you have to mobilize a lot of energy. It's the exact opposite of what you're doing when you take up a gallon of oil, where the energy is densely concentrated and compact and you can set it on fire. But once you've set it on fire, the energy is dissipated and it goes out, and you have these CO2 molecules. And here is a core problem of DAC, that to get DAC to work on a scale that makes a real difference, you need to mobilize absolutely enormous amounts of electricity to run these machines, because the thermodynamics of the operation are such that to catch these thinly spread CO2 molecules, the electricity demand is absolutely insane. Now, so what Saudi Aramco and Exxon and others are doing here is probably that they envision a situation where sometime in the future, perhaps the only way they can protect their existing assets is to show that, but we have this technology to actually nullify our environmental impact and make sure that the waste that we produce is turned into something useful. This is a general problem also of all forms of DAC or carbon dioxide removal, from the standpoint of a capitalist company. If you have captured a stream of CO2, what are you going to do with it? There are essentially two options. You can sell it to others as a commodity and profit from it, or you can bury it under the ground, in which case it's extremely difficult to get a profit out of it because it's decommodified, it's negated, it cannot be used as an input in a production cycle, it cannot be consumed, it's just put under the ground. This creates for an incentive for all DAC companies to not use DAC or any other CDR technology to actually remove the CO2 from the active carbon cycle and put it under the ground, but instead use it as a commodity. So if you go and look at Climeworks DAC facilities in Switzerland, for instance, what they're doing with the CO2 that they capture is that they sell it to Coca-Cola as a fizz for their drink, or to greenhouses as fertilizers, or do anything else that you can do with CO2, because that way the CO2 is turned into a commodity and the company can potentially profit from it. But there are only in the entire world 2 facilities for taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere through DAC and pumping it down into the ground and mineralizing it. These are both in Iceland and they're run by Climeworks. But the way they're trying to make a profit from this is to offer rich consumers a kind of a diploma of climate virtue, where you can buy this paper and say, okay, I mineralized this and that amount of CO2, and you put it on the wall and you show that you're a good person or something like that. Is this a business model that's really going to take off? I mean, it's very difficult to see that this can earn Climeworks or anyone else a massive profit. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to spend a few final words on the real big thing, which is solar geoengineering. Let's just make my point clear on carbon dioxide removal. So, there are going to be political struggles around carbon dioxide removal as well. And one of the fronts will be, are we going to use emerging DAC technology in particular to sustain fossil fuel companies and keep them going with the illusion that they can produce carbon neutral, climate friendly oil and gas, because that's the sort of ultimate horizon they're working on? Or are we going to shut down the fossil fuel companies and potentially use DAC and other technologies to clean up historical emissions? These are 2 very different things. Okay, lastly, solar geoengineering. Yeah. When you looked at the commission yesterday, headed by Pascal Lamy, this former director of the WTO, clearly this is the most uncomfortable of the 3 prongs of overshoot management. The one that really makes people worried about what's in store. And they shied away very notably from endorsing it. What they said was that we're going to have to explore it, but they proposed a moratorium on deploying it or having large experiments. because there have been attempts to experiment with this recently in Mexico and elsewhere. I don't think that Pascal Lamy or other individuals of that kind, politically belonging to what I would consider the enemy camp, are out of evil designs pushing for this secretly or anything. But I think that there is a structural imperative at work that makes it extremely likely that we're going to see solar geoengineering rolled out in one form or another pretty soon. If that means 5 years from now, 15 years from now, 25, we don't know. No one can know. But that structural imperative is the following. The climate crisis is completely out of control. It could hardly be worse. Nothing, like I said, nothing so far has worked to contain the crisis in any way. The symptoms of this crisis get worse by the day, it feels like, at least by the year. And at one point, the incredible inertia of capitalist society might snap, and some leaders of this society will say, okay, we have to do something. We have to get this situation under control. What can we do? Well, there's only one technology on offer that has the capacity to slash temperatures from one moment to the next, as in from 1 month to the next, and that is solar geoengineering. Carbon dioxide removal can only work its potential wonders over decades or centuries, and it's actually the same thing with mitigation. Solar geoengineering is the only technology with a known capacity to, you shoot out the aerosols in the stratosphere and you immediately reduce emissions. And this makes the temptation of doing this look quite strong in the years and decades ahead. Now, the greatest danger of it is, I'm wrapping up. The greatest danger of it is, of course, that if it works in the way that it advocates promise, and it does reduce temperatures on Earth, so it stops, for instance, let's say extremely lethal heat waves rolling around the globe, or floods for that matter, then there would be a sigh of relief, and oof, finally, we have some kind of technology that is putting this under control. And then the inducement to keep going with business as usual will just be reinforced, because the main reason for stopping business as usual, namely climate disasters, will have been put on pause. And the overwhelming risk is that this would just serve as a kind of a shield on further deepening, entrenching, accelerating business as usual, with the risk down at the pipeline of a terrible termination shock, where you have to switch off the solar geoengineering because the negative side effects have been so large, and all of this warming that has accumulated in the meantime but being negated by this shield, the stratospheric shield, is instantly activated, and you get temperature rises by perhaps several degrees per decade, and it's essentially game over. Now, this is just a very, very brief summary of an argument that I've made elsewhere, and I think actually, and this ties into something that Sighard and others have been writing about, to understand what's going on here, I think we need to go beyond political economy of the classical kind and go into psychology, and more specifically psychoanalysis. Geoengineering to me seems to be almost a perfect picture of Freudian repression, where the return of the repressed is inevitable. And I do think that to understand how our society works right now, psychoanalytical instruments become more and more indispensable by the day, because what society is doing is it's digging itself deeper and deeper into various mechanisms of denial, and the only way that this denial can survive in the end seems to be to switch into the repression that would be geoengineering. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Sorry for taking so much time.